The house stays with me. So do the accounts.
You planned this carefully.
I planned ahead.
This was never disclosed.
Where did you get that?
You left it behind.
Richard Miller was 43, a senior compliance analyst at Midwest Freight Systems in Chicago. Most people believed he was the kind of man who got left behind in his own marriage. Quiet, predictable, easy to overlook. He drove a faded 2013 Camry, packed the same chicken sandwich every morning, clocked out at exactly 6:10 p.m. What they didn't know was that Richard used to trace financial fraud for a living, and he never ignored patterns. The courtroom air felt dry as his lawyer slit open the forgotten envelope. Richard leaned forward. Then his fingers tightened, slow, deliberate, as he saw what was inside. If you're watching this, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always find it fascinating where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow burn stories with real twists, hit subscribe. This one is just getting started. Richard Miller never raised his voice. That was the first thing people noticed. And the last thing they remembered. The house on Brookdale Lane in Naperville was technically theirs. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, white siding, trimmed hedges, a maple tree that turned red every October. But the paperwork told a different story. Charlotte's name sat alone on the mortgage. Richard had signed where he was told to sign. 7 years earlier. A refinance, she said. Better rate. Cleaner structure. He had skimmed the pages, paused once at the title line, then signed anyway. He remembered the pen. Blue ink. Slightly dry. That was the kind of detail he noticed. And kept. Every morning Richard left at 7:20 a.m. Same route. Ogden Avenue, then I-88, then down toward the industrial stretch near Cicero. Midwest Freight Systems didn't look like much from the outside. Flat gray building, loading docks, rows of parked semis. But inside, numbers moved constantly. Shipments, invoices, compliance reports. Richard lived in those numbers. At 12:05 p.m., he opened his lunch. Chicken sandwich, apple, sometimes a granola bar. He ate at his desk. No small talk, no scrolling. Just quiet chewing and a spreadsheet open on one monitor. At 6:10 p.m., he shut down his computer. Not 609, not 611. Consistency wasn't a habit for him. It was a system. Charlotte didn't follow systems. She built momentum. She worked out of Lakeshore Realty Group, downtown Chicago. Glass office, open floor plan, floor-to-ceiling windows facing Lake Michigan. Her phone rang constantly. Listings, showings, deals closing. She drove a black Range Rover. Leased but upgraded every 2 years. Her days didn't have fixed hours. They had outcomes. When she walked into a room, people turned. Not because she was loud, because she was certain. Her sentences didn't drift. They landed. Richard noticed that too. Dinner, when they had it together, usually happened after 8:30 p.m. Charlotte would come in with her heels still on, drop her bag on the kitchen island and talk while moving. Closed the Lincoln Park deal today. 3% over asking. Richard nodded, fork in hand, listening. We're looking at another property on West Loop. Might need to move fast. Another nod. She didn't ask what he thought. Not directly. And Richard didn't offer. On paper, it looked functional, stable, even successful. But the flow of money told a different story. The main account, the one that handled mortgage payments, utilities, large transfers, was under Charlotte's control. Richard had access, technically. His name was attached as an authorized user. But control wasn't about access. It was about movement. Charlotte moved money. Richard observed it. The first time he noticed something off, it was small. A transfer. $18,700. Outgoing. Labeled as consulting fee. The recipient, North Bend Holdings, LLC. He didn't recognize the name. He clicked into the transaction details. Limited information, routing number, bank in Illinois. No further description. That night during dinner, Charlotte talked about a property in Evanston. Something about zoning approvals and timelines. Richard waited until she paused to take a sip of water. "What's North Bend Holdings?" he asked. Charlotte didn't look up immediately. She set the glass down, then wiped a drop of water from the rim with her thumb. "Investment partner," she said. "Short-term, nothing major." Her tone didn't shift. Not defensive, not casual. Just efficient. Richard nodded. "Okay." He went back to his plate. That was it. No follow-up, no tension. But later that night at 11:42 p.m., while Charlotte was in the bedroom on a call, Richard sat in the dim light of the living room, laptop open, the glow reflecting in his glasses. He opened a blank Excel file. Column A date, column B amount, column C recipient, column D notes. He entered the transaction. 0314, $18,700 North Bend Holdings, LLC consulting fee. Charlotte. Then he saved the file. Not on the desktop, not in documents. He created a new folder, nested inside 3 others, named it something that didn't draw attention. System logs, archive. He closed the laptop. The next transfer came 9 days later. $9,250. Same recipient, same vague label. This time Richard didn't ask. He added it to the file. Days passed. Then weeks. More transactions appeared. Different amounts. Different days. But the same pattern. Always outgoing. Always tied to entities with neutral names. Lakeview Assets, LLC. Harborline Group. Names that sounded real enough to avoid suspicion. Richard didn't confront her. Because confrontation required proof. And proof required time. Instead, he adjusted his routine. At work during lunch, he began checking the account history more closely. Not just recent transactions, but patterns over months. He exported statements, cross-referenced dates. At home, he paid attention to Charlotte's calls. Not the content. He didn't need to hear every word. Just names. "Ethan, I'll send that over tonight." "Yeah, we'll route it through the same structure." No, Richard doesn't handle any of that. "Ethan." The name came up more than once. Richard didn't react. Not outwardly, but he added a new column in his spreadsheet. Column E, associated names. He typed it in. Ethan, multiple mentions calls. He leaned back in his chair. The house was quiet, except for Charlotte's voice behind the bedroom door, steady and controlled. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, not in frustration, in alignment, because the pattern was starting to take shape. Money didn't just disappear, it moved with intent, and intent left traces. He just had to follow them. The next morning he left the house at 7:20 a.m. Same route, same traffic, same radio station murmuring low in the background, but his hands on the steering wheel felt different. Not tense, just aware. At a red light on Ogden, he glanced at the clock. 7:43 a.m., then back at the road. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was preparing. And Charlotte still believed she was the only one moving pieces on the board. That belief would hold. For now. The numbers didn't spike. They repeated. That was what made Richard pause. Anyone could hide a large transaction. One big transfer buried inside a busy account could pass unnoticed. But repetition created rhythm, and rhythm created visibility. On April 2nd, another transfer appeared. $12,400. Lakeview Assets, LLC. Richard didn't react immediately. He waited until his lunch break, 12:05 p.m. sharp, then opened the account from his work terminal. Same login, same quiet posture, same slow, deliberate clicks. He didn't just look at the new transaction. He scrolled back. March, February, January. Patterns emerged like faint lines under tracing paper. Every 9 to 12 days, money left the account. Different amounts, always under $20,000, never round numbers, always labeled vaguely consulting advisory property development fees, always to LLCs, North Bend, Lakeview, Harbor Line, 3 names, rotating. Richard exported the last 6 months of statements. He didn't rush it. Each file downloaded with a small blinking icon in the corner of his screen. He renamed them immediately. Date format first, then account, then category. He didn't trust default names. At 12:37 p.m., he opened a second spreadsheet, this one more complex. Pivot tables, conditional formatting, filters. He grouped transactions by recipient. North Bend Holdings, 7 transfers, Lakeview Assets, 5 transfers. Harbor Line Group, 6 transfers, total $142,350. Richard leaned back slightly. His face didn't change, but his fingers hovered above the keyboard longer than usual. That wasn't incidental, that was structure. At 1:02 p.m., his phone buzzed once on the desk. A message from Charlotte. Dinner late tonight, showing in Gold Coast. He read it. Didn't respond immediately. Then typed, OK. Sent. Minimal words. No punctuation beyond what was needed. He returned to the spreadsheet. Column F. He added it. Pattern interval days. Then he calculated. Not exact, but consistent enough. Richard closed the file. Not because he was done, because he had seen enough for now. That night the house was quiet when he got home. 6:12 p.m., 2 minutes later than usual. Traffic on I-88 had slowed near the exit. He placed his keys in the same spot on the kitchen counter. Second tile from the edge. Slight crack running diagonally across it. He noticed that crack every day. Dinner was simple. Leftover pasta, heated in the microwave for exactly 2 minutes, stirred once halfway through. At 8:47 p.m., Charlotte walked in. He heard her before he saw her. The quick rhythm of heels on hardwood. The soft thud of her bag hitting the counter. Long day, she said, exhaling. Richard looked up from the couch. ESPN flickering silently in front of him. How'd it go, he asked. Closed another deal. River North, cash buyer. She moved while talking. Always moving. Opening the fridge. Pouring water. Checking her phone. Ethan's pushing for another project, she added almost as an afterthought. Richard didn't look at her. Just nodded. Ethan again. The name sat quietly in his mind. Not heavy, just placed. Busy guy, Richard said. Charlotte gave a small, distracted smile. Yeah, something like that. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Richard wasn't asking for details. He was collecting them. Later that night at 11:18 p.m., Charlotte was in the bedroom again. Door half closed. Voice low but steady. Richard sat at the dining table this time. Laptop open. A legal pad beside it. He wasn't typing. He was writing. Names, dates, arrows connecting them. North Bend, Ethan Lakeview, Ethan Harbor Line. He paused at the question mark, then flipped back through his notes. There it was. A call 2 weeks ago. Harbor Line's ready to move forward, Charlotte had said. Same tone, same cadence. He wrote it down, then circled all 3 LLCs. Drew a box around Ethan's name. Not a conclusion. A working model. At 11:42 p.m., Charlotte's voice stopped. Silence filled the house. Richard closed the notebook, slid it into a drawer. Not the top one. The second. Behind a stack of old mail. He didn't hide things randomly. He placed them where they wouldn't be found accidentally. The next morning he adjusted something. Not his routine, his access. At work during a brief window between meetings, he logged into a secondary system. One that most employees didn't use daily. Compliance audit tools. He still had clearance, not high level, but enough. He ran a simple search. North Bend Holdings LLC. The system returned minimal data. Registered in Illinois. Standard filing. No red flags. Lakeview Assets. Same result. Harbor Line Group. Again clean. Richard stared at the screen. Too clean. Companies that moved that much money usually left some trace. A delayed filing. A minor discrepancy. Something. These didn't. Which meant one of 2 things. Either everything was perfectly legitimate, or everything was being managed very carefully. Richard closed the system. He didn't push further. Not yet. At 2:15 p.m., he stepped outside the building for the first time that day. The air was warm, late spring in Chicago, a slight breeze carrying the smell of asphalt and distant traffic. He stood near the edge of the parking lot, hands in his pockets, watching nothing in particular, but thinking. If Charlotte was moving money through LLCs tied to Ethan, if those LLCs showed no irregularities on surface-level checks, then the real activity wasn't in the companies themselves. It was in how they were being used, ownership, transfers, signatures. That was where things broke. That was where mistakes happened. Richard exhaled slowly, then turned back towards the building. He didn't feel angry. He didn't feel betrayed. Those emotions required certainty. He wasn't there yet. What he felt was alignment. Pieces fitting into place. Later that evening, Charlotte didn't come home until after 10. When she did, she was quieter than usual. No immediate recap of her day, no running commentary. She poured a glass of wine, sat at the edge of the kitchen island. Richard noticed the shift. Subtle, but there. "Everything okay?" he asked. Charlotte shrugged slightly. "Just tired." He nodded. Didn't push, but he watched. She picked up her phone, scrolled, paused, typed something quickly, then locked the screen. Her thumb hovered a fraction of a second longer than necessary before setting it down. Micro-hesitation. Richard had seen it before. Not often, but enough. "Big deal coming up?" he asked. Charlotte looked at him this time. Directly. "Yeah," she said. "Something like that." A beat passed. Then she stood, picked up her glass, and walked toward the bedroom. Conversation over. Richard remained where he was, sitting. Still. The TV flickered in the background, casting soft light across the room. He didn't turn it off. He didn't move. He just replayed the moment. The hesitation. The glance. The tone. Small things. But small things repeated became patterns. And patterns told the truth. Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. Then he stood, walked to the counter, picked up his phone, opened the Notes app, and typed one word. Ethan? Then beneath it, not just business. He stared at the screen for a second, then locked the phone, placed it back down exactly where it had been. Tomorrow he would go back to work, eat the same lunch, drive the same route, say the same few words. Nothing would change on the surface, but underneath, the pattern was tightening. And for the first time, Richard was certain of one thing. This wasn't just about money. Richard didn't confront her. Not when the numbers crossed 100,000. Not when Ethan's name appeared 3 times in a single week. Not even when the pattern became undeniable. Because confrontation ended movement. And Richard needed the movement to continue. The following Monday, he adjusted his process again. At 6:58 a.m., before leaving the house, he stood in the kitchen longer than usual. Coffee in hand, not drinking it, just holding it while Charlotte moved around him, checking emails on her phone. "You're heading downtown today?" he asked. Charlotte didn't look up. "Yeah, meetings all morning." He nodded. "Long day. Always?" She grabbed her keys, paused for half a second, then added, "Might stay overnight if things run late." Richard took a sip of coffee. Okay, no questions, no reaction. Charlotte left at 7:11 a.m., earlier than usual. Richard waited. Not out of suspicion, out of habit. He counted. 10 seconds after the front door closed, then 20, then 30. Only then did he move. He walked to the counter where Charlotte had been standing. The faint imprint of her phone remained in the dustless surface. A clean rectangle. He didn't touch anything, just observed. Then he turned, picked up his own keys, and left. At work, Richard didn't open the spreadsheet immediately. Instead, he logged into the compliance audit system again. This time he ran a different search. Ethan Cole. The name returned more data. Real estate developer, registered in Illinois, multiple business filings, several partnerships across Chicago and surrounding counties. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious. But volume. Ethan wasn't small. Richard opened the business registry details, scanned the list of associated entities. There they were. North Bend Holdings, Lakeview Assets, Harborline Group, all connected, not hidden, just layered. Richard leaned slightly closer to the screen. Ownership structure multi-tiered. Primary members masked behind intermediary entities. Standard practice for asset protection. Nothing illegal by itself, but combined with personal account transfers, different context. Richard closed the file, then opened a blank document. Not Excel. A simple text file. He began typing. Ethan Cole confirmed linkage to all 3 LLCs. Then, beneath it, Charlotte Miller repeated transfers to linked entities. He paused, then added a third line. Potential commingling of marital assets. He saved the file. Again, not in an obvious location. Then he minimized everything. From the outside, nothing had changed. He was still the same employee, same posture, same quiet presence. But internally, he had shifted roles. Not a husband reacting to a situation, an investigator building a case. That night, Charlotte didn't come home. At 9:14 p.m., a message arrived. Staying at the hotel. Early meeting tomorrow. Richard read it once, then placed the phone face down. No reply. He stood in the living room for a moment, listening to the silence. The house felt different without her movement, without the constant background noise of her calls, her heels, her presence. Still, controlled. Richard walked upstairs, entered the bedroom. Charlotte's side of the closet was half open. Rows of dresses color-coordinated, shoes aligned beneath them. Nothing out of place. He didn't search. That wasn't his method. Instead, he stepped back and looked. Patterns weren't just in numbers. They were in behavior, in routine, in absence. He closed the closet gently, then sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, eyes steady. He wasn't imagining scenarios. He was waiting for confirmation. The next morning, he left the house at the same time. Same route, same radio station. But halfway through the drive, he made a decision. Not emotional, operational. At 8:22 a.m., he pulled into a parking lot off Route 59, turned off the engine, sat in silence, then picked up his phone, opened the banking app, navigated to account permissions. He didn't change anything. He just reviewed. Access logs, devices used, login times. Charlotte had logged in at 6:48 a.m. Location tagged downtown Chicago, consistent with her message. But there was another login, 2:13 a.m. Same account, different device. Richard stared at the screen. Device ID unfamiliar. Location also downtown. He didn't react, just memorized it. Then he locked the phone, started the engine, and merged back into traffic. At 10:05 a.m., he was back at his desk. At 10:07, he opened the spreadsheet, added a new column, access anomalies, then entered the data. 0421 2:13 a.m. unknown device, Chicago. He didn't label it as suspicious, just recorded, because labels could bias interpretation. Data didn't. At lunch, he didn't eat immediately. Instead, he opened another system, this one external. Public records, property transactions. He searched Ethan Cole, dozens of entries, recent acquisitions, joint ventures, development permits. Then he filtered by date. Last 3 months. A pattern emerged. Several properties acquired through LLCs. Same names, North Bend, Lakeview. Richard cross-referenced the dates. Each acquisition lined up within days of the transfers from his account. He leaned back slowly. There it was. Not just movement, purpose. The money wasn't sitting. It was being used, converted, hidden inside assets. Richard closed the browser, then finally unwrapped his sandwich, took a bite, chewed slowly. His expression didn't change, but inside something settled. Not anger, not shock, certainty. That evening, Charlotte returned home at 7:36 p.m., earlier than expected. She walked in quieter than usual. No immediate update, no fast-paced movement, just slower steps. Richard noticed. Back early, he said. She nodded. Meeting got cancelled. A pause. Then she added, "We should talk." Richard looked at her. Not surprised. Just attentive. About what he asked. Charlotte set her bag down carefully this time. Not the usual drop. About things she said, vague, deliberate. Richard stood. Walked to the kitchen island, stopped across from her. The space between them felt measured, controlled. He didn't fill it. Charlotte took a breath, then looked directly at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but Richard noticed something, not in her words, in her timing. She was choosing when to speak, just like he was choosing when not to, and for the first time, their strategies were about to collide. Charlotte didn't speak immediately. She stood there, hands resting lightly on the edge of the kitchen island, her fingers-aligned nails clean, deliberate, the same precision she used when signing contracts. Richard noticed her breathing first, slightly slower than usual. Measured, controlled. "We should talk," she repeated. Richard didn't sit. He didn't move closer either. He stayed exactly where he was, creating a distance that wasn't accidental. About what he asked again, same tone. Flat, neutral. Charlotte tilted her head just slightly, a gesture she used when deciding how much to reveal. "About where things are going," she said. "Not where we are. Not what happened." Future tense. Richard nodded once. "Okay." She waited. He didn't fill the silence. That was new. Usually people filled silence around Charlotte. They adjusted to her pace, her rhythm, her need to control the flow. Richard didn't. He let it sit. Charlotte exhaled quietly. "I don't think this is working anymore," she said. Direct, clean, no hesitation now. Richard watched her face, not searching for emotion, just observing consistency. Her tone matched her posture. No tremor, no break. This wasn't spontaneous, it was scheduled. "How long have you felt that way?" he asked. Charlotte's eyes flickered just for a fraction of a second. Not because of the question, because of the precision. "Does it matter?" she replied. "It does to me," Richard said. No emphasis, no tension, just fact. Charlotte looked away briefly, then back. "A while," she said, not specific. Richard noted it mentally. "Months?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Then, yes? That was the first concrete data point. Richard nodded again. He didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't ask why. Because why led to narratives. And narratives could be shaped. He was tracking facts. Charlotte shifted her weight slightly. "I think we should separate," she continued. "Take some space, figure things out." The phrasing was careful. Separate before divorce. A soft entry. Richard leaned one hand on the counter, not heavily, just enough to anchor himself. "Are you asking," he said, "or telling me?" Charlotte held his gaze. "I'm telling you." There it was, clear, unambiguous. Richard didn't respond immediately. He let the statement settle in the room, not emotionally, structurally. This wasn't a discussion. It was a declaration. "Okay," he said, "one word, no resistance." Charlotte blinked once. That wasn't the reaction she expected. People pushed back, negotiated, asked for reasons, promised changes. Richard didn't. He accepted. And that shifted something. Subtle, but real. She straightened slightly. "We can figure out logistics," she said. "I'll talk to a lawyer. Make it clean." Richard nodded. "Clean is good." Another unexpected answer. Charlotte studied him now, not casually, carefully. "You're okay with this?" she asked. Richard tilted his head a fraction. What would not being okay look like, he said. Not sarcastic, just precise. Charlotte didn't answer, because the question reframed the situation. Emotion wasn't the variable here. Process was. Richard pushed off the counter, walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, let the water run for a second longer than necessary before rinsing a clean glass. He wasn't thirsty. He was resetting the moment. Small action, controlled. Behind him, Charlotte spoke again. "I'll probably stay downtown more often," she said, "until things are finalized." Richard turned off the water, dried the glass with a towel. "Okay." Same response. No friction, no resistance. Charlotte picked up her bag again. "Not leaving yet, just holding it." "There's someone I've been working closely with," she added. "Not a confession, a positioning." Richard didn't turn around immediately. He placed the glass back in the cabinet, closed the door, then faced her. "Ethan," he said. Charlotte froze, not visibly, but in timing. A fraction too long before her next breath. Richard saw it, measured it. "You know him?" she asked. "By name," Richard said, nothing more. Charlotte's posture tightened just slightly. Not defensive, alert? How she asked. Richard shrugged faintly. "You mention him." That was true. And incomplete. Charlotte searched his face for a second, looking for something. Emotion, suspicion, accusation. She found none, because there was none displayed. Richard wasn't confronting, he was confirming. She nodded slowly. "Right," she said. A small step back. Recalibrating. "He's involved in some of the projects," she added. Neutral explanation, business context. Richard didn't challenge it. "Seems like it," he said. Charlotte exhaled again, this time slightly deeper. Something in the interaction wasn't aligning with her expectations. She had initiated control, but she wasn't dictating the rhythm anymore. Richard walked past her toward the living room. Not dismissing, just moving. "I'll be upstairs," he said. "Early morning tomorrow." Normal sentence, normal tone. But it closed the conversation. Charlotte didn't stop him, didn't follow. She stood in the kitchen, still holding her bag, watching him leave the room. Richard didn't look back. Upstairs, he entered the bedroom, sat at the edge of the bed again. Same position as the night before, hands on knees. But this time his mind wasn't building patterns. It was validating them. Separation. Lawyer. Ethan. Timing aligned. The structure was no longer hidden. It was unfolding. Richard reached into the drawer beside the bed, pulled out the notebook, opened to the last page. He added a new section. Event separation initiated. Then beneath it, Charlotte confirms ongoing collaboration with Ethan. He paused, then added one more line. Escalation expected. He closed the notebook, placed it back, turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but Richard's breathing remained steady, slow, even. Because for him, this wasn't the moment things fell apart. It was the moment everything became clear, and clarity was the most useful thing he had. Downstairs, Charlotte finally moved, set her bag down again, poured another glass of wine. But her movements were slower now, less certain. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure what Richard knew, and Richard had no intention of telling her. Not yet. Charlotte didn't wait long. 3 days. That was all it took. On Thursday at 4:18 p.m., while Richard was still at his desk reviewing a compliance report. His phone vibrated once. A new email. Subject line short. Direct. Notice of filing. He opened it immediately. Petitioner Charlotte Miller, Court Circuit Court of Cook County, grounds irreconcilable differences. No emotion, no explanation, just process. Richard read it once. Then again. Not for content, for structure. Filed at 3:52 p.m., less than 30 minutes before he received it. Efficient, timed. She hadn't mentioned a specific date, but she had already prepared everything. Richard closed the email, minimized the window, then opened his spreadsheet. New entry. 0427. Divorce filing initiated Cook County. He didn't label it as unexpected, because it wasn't. At 6:10 p.m., he shut down his computer. Same time, same motion. Nothing changed. On the drive home, traffic moved slowly near the exit toward Naperville. A construction zone narrowed the lanes. Orange cones lined the road. Cars inching forward, then stopping. Richard rested his hand lightly on the steering wheel. Waiting. He didn't rush. There was no urgency left in the situation, only sequence. When he pulled into the driveway at 6:43 p.m., Charlotte's car was already there. Unusual. She was rarely home before 7:30. Richard turned off the engine, sat for a moment, then stepped out. The front door was unlocked. Inside the house felt staged. Lights on in the living room. Kitchen clean. No clutter. No movement. Charlotte stood near the dining table, a folder in her hand. Not her usual leather bag. Something thinner, lighter, deliberate. "You got the email," she'd said. Not a question. Richard nodded. Yes. He closed the door behind him, placed his keys in the same spot. Second tile. Hairline crack. Charlotte watched him do it. That detail didn't escape her anymore. "We should go over this," she said, lifting the folder slightly. Richard walked toward the kitchen island. Stopped. Now he asked. "Yes, immediate." Richard nodded. "Okay." Charlotte stepped closer, opened the folder. Papers neatly arranged. Tabs marking sections. Prepared. She placed it on the counter between them. "This is a preliminary agreement," she said. "Division of assets. It's straightforward." Richard didn't reach for it yet. He looked at her first, then down at the folder. Then, finally, he opened it. Page 1. Property Brookdale Lane residence awarded to Charlotte Miller. Vehicle Range Rover Charlotte. Joint account balance majority allocation to Charlotte, citing primary contributor. Richard's eyes moved steadily across the page. No pause, no visible reaction. Page 2. Retirement accounts. Investments. Most tied to Charlotte's name. Structurally correct. On paper. Richard turned the page. Personal property. Furniture. Miscellaneous assets. Assigned quickly. Efficiently. No ambiguity. He reached the final page. Signature lines. Charlotte's signature already there. Dated 4:02 p.m., 16 minutes before the email. Richard closed the folder, placed his hand on top of it, not pressing down, just resting. "You worked fast," he said. Charlotte's expression didn't change. "I planned ahead." Richard nodded once. That makes sense. He didn't challenge the terms, didn't argue fairness, didn't point out discrepancies. Because that would signal engagement, and engagement at this stage would limit observation. "You should have a lawyer look at it," Charlotte added. "Standard line. Expected." "I will," Richard said. Charlotte studied him again, looking for resistance, finding none. "You're not going to fight this?" she asked. Richard met her gaze. "What would I be fighting?" he said. The question landed quietly. Charlotte blinked once, then exhaled. "It's a fair division," she said, "given everything." Richard tilted his head slightly, given what he asked. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Then, given our situation? Vague again, non-specific. Richard nodded. "Okay." He picked up the folder, closed it fully. "I'll review it," he said. Charlotte's posture shifted again, less certain now. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't. No objection, no negotiation, no attempt to retain anything. That wasn't normal. Richard, she said. He paused, turned slightly. Yes, you understand this means you'll need to move out. There it was. Direct. Operational. Richard nodded. I figured. Charlotte watched his face carefully. You're okay with that same question as before, different context. Richard considered it for a second. Not emotionally, logistically. I'll find a place, he said. Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. Good. Conversation complete. At least on her side. She closed the folder again, this time pushing it slightly toward him. Ownership transferred. Richard picked it up without comment, walked past her. Upstairs. No slam of doors. No raised voices. Just quiet movement. In the bedroom, he placed the folder on the dresser. Didn't open it again. Instead, he sat down, pulled out his notebook, turned to a new page. Event divorce filing executed. Then beneath it, preliminary agreement heavily favors Charlotte. He paused, then added confidence level high on her side. He underlined it once. Not hard, just enough to mark importance. Then he leaned back slightly, looking at the ceiling. The situation was now formal, documented, legal, which meant the system was active. And once the system was active, it followed rules. Rules required evidence, not narratives, not assumptions, evidence. Richard stood, walked to the closet, opened the door, looked at his side. Half the space, neatly arranged, predictable. He closed it again, then picked up his phone, opened a contact, Daniel Brooks, saved weeks ago, not recently, not after the filing, before. He didn't call immediately, just looked at the name, then locked the phone. Timing mattered. Everything had a sequence. Downstairs, Charlotte poured another glass of wine, but her movements were sharper now, faster, less controlled. Because something didn't feel right. Richard hadn't resisted, hadn't negotiated, hadn't even questioned the imbalance. And that was harder to read than anger. Upstairs, Richard turned off the light, sat in the dark, and for the first time since the email arrived, he allowed a single thought to settle. Not about loss, not about separation, about position. On paper, he had nothing. In reality, he was just getting started. The first court appearance lasted 23 minutes. Richard timed it. He sat on the left side of the courtroom's second row behind his attorney, Daniel Brooks. The room smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above. Charlotte sat across the aisle. Composed, focused. Dressed in a navy blazer that matched the folder in her hand. Beside her, Amanda Pierce, sharp, efficient, known in Cook County for fast settlements and aggressive filings. Richard noticed the way Amanda leaned forward slightly when speaking. Controlled intensity. Every sentence measured to land with precision. He respected that. It meant she followed structure, and structure could be predicted. Mr. Miller, Daniel Brooks, said quietly, without turning around, just observe today. Richard nodded. I understand. The judge entered at 9:02 a.m. Proceedings began immediately. Charlotte's side moved first. Amanda stood voice steady, outlining the case with clean efficiency. My client seeks an equitable distribution of marital assets consistent with her primary financial contribution and existing ownership structures. Richard didn't look at Charlotte. He watched the judge. Not expressions, timing. When the judge wrote something down, when she paused, when she interrupted. Patterns. Amanda continued. The marital residence is solely in my client's name. The majority of investment accounts are likewise held under her ownership. We are proposing a division that reflects these realities. Clean, structured. On paper, it worked. Daniel Brooks stood when it was his turn. Slower, less theatrical. We acknowledge the current ownership structure, he said. However, we request time to review the full scope of marital financial activity before agreeing to final terms. Simple. No confrontation, no claims, just time. Amanda didn't object, because at this stage there was nothing to contest. The judge nodded. Temporary terms will follow the preliminary agreement, she said. Further review scheduled in 4 weeks. Gavel, done. 23 minutes. Richard stood when Brooks did. No rush. No visible reaction. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with low conversations. Lawyers moving quickly, papers shifting hands. Phones pressed to ears. Charlotte stepped aside with Amanda. They spoke quietly, close, aligned. Richard didn't approach. He stood near the wall, hands in his coat pockets, watching the reflection of movement in the glass panel across from him. Brooks turned to him. "You handled that well," he said. Richard gave a slight nod. It was expected. Brooks studied him for a second, noticing the absence of stress. That agreement, Brooks added, lowering his voice, it leaves you with almost nothing. Richard didn't respond immediately, because almost nothing depended on definition. "I know," he said. Brooks waited, expecting something more. Frustration? Concern? A question? Nothing came. "You're not concerned?" Brooks asked. Richard looked at him. "Direct?" "I'm not unprepared," he said. That answer lingered. Brooks didn't push further. "Not yet." "Let's step outside," he said. They walked toward the exit. Cold air hit as the courthouse doors opened. Chicago wind cutting through the space between buildings. Richard adjusted his coat slightly. Across the street, Charlotte and Amanda stood near a black sedan. Amanda spoke first. Charlotte nodded, then looked briefly toward the courthouse doors. Her eyes found Richard. For a moment they held. Not emotional, not soft. Assessment. Then she turned away. Got into the car. The door closed with a muted thud. Gone. Richard watched the car pull away, then turned back to Brooks. "Walk me through it," Brooks said. Richard didn't ask what he meant. He knew. "What do you have?" Brooks continued. Not accusing, just direct. Richard exhaled once, measured. "Transactions," he said, "multiple LLCs. Repeated transfers over several months." Brooks's expression didn't change. "Amounts 6 figures total." Brooks nodded slowly. "Documentation, yes." How solid Richard met his gaze. "Traceable," he said. That was the right word. Not strong, not suspicious. Traceable, meaning it could be followed, verified, proven. Brooks crossed his arms slightly. "Why didn't you bring this up earlier?" Richard looked back at the courthouse doors. "Because it wasn't complete." Brooks considered that, then asked the next question. "Is it complete now?" Richard paused. "Not long. Not fully," he said, "but it's enough to continue." Brooks nodded once. That answer told him everything he needed. "You've been building this for a while," he said. Richard didn't confirm, didn't deny. Silence was confirmation. Brooks exhaled lightly. "Okay," he said. "Then we don't rush." Richard agreed. Rushing meant exposure. And exposure without full structure weakened the case. "What about her side?" Brooks asked. Anything beyond financial, Richard thought for a moment. Then Ethan Cole. Brooks' eyes narrowed slightly. "The developer." "Yes." "Connection Financial." "Frequent? Possibly more?" Brooks nodded slowly. "Keep it factual," he said. "No assumptions." "I know." They stood in silence for a second. Traffic moved steadily past them. A bus hissed to a stop at the corner. People crossed the street without looking up. Normal life continuing. Inside a system that didn't care about narratives, only evidence. Bring me everything, Brooks said finally. Organized, chronological, no gaps. Richard nodded. "I will." Brooks looked at him one more time. Longer this time. "You don't look like a man who just lost his house," he said. Richard's expression didn't change. "Did I?" he replied. Brooks didn't answer. because the question wasn't rhetorical. It was structural. Ownership on paper, control in reality. Two different things. They parted ways at the corner. Richard walked toward the parking garage, each step steady, measured. He didn't replay the hearing, didn't think about Charlotte's terms. Those were surface-level outcomes. Temporary. What mattered was beneath. Movement of money, connections, timing. He reached his car, unlocked it, sat inside, hands resting on the steering wheel. Then he took out his phone, opened his notes, added a new entry. Event preliminary, hearing temporary terms accepted. Then beneath it, Charlotte, confident. Legal position strong, surface level. He paused, then added, window open. He stared at the words for a second, then locked the phone, started the engine, merged into traffic. From the outside, it looked like he had just lost everything. House, money, position. But Richard wasn't looking at what was visible. He was looking at what was still moving. And movement could still be traced. Richard didn't go home right away. After leaving the courthouse parking garage, he drove west away from Naperville, past familiar exits, past the rhythm of his usual route. The skyline of Chicago faded behind him, replaced by low commercial buildings and wide suburban roads. At 10:42 a.m., he pulled into a quiet lot behind a brick office complex in Oak Brook. Daniel Brooks's secondary office, less crowded, less visible. Richard sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, not hesitating, just resetting. Inside the office was quieter than the downtown branch. Carpeted floors, neutral walls, a receptionist who barely looked up as Brooks waved him through. They didn't sit in a conference room. Brooks led him into a smaller office, closed the door. "No interruptions here," he said. Richard nodded. He placed a slim black folder on the desk. Not the one Charlotte had given him. This one was his. Brooks sat down slowly. "Let's see it." Richard didn't speak. He opened the folder. Inside were printed sheets, organized, numbered, tabbed, not random, not rushed, structured. Brooks leaned forward. The first section was labeled Account Transfers January to April. Rows of transactions, dates, amounts, recipients, highlighted patterns. Brooks flipped the first page, then the second, then the third. No comments yet, just reading. The second section, entity mapping. 3 names circled: North Bend Holdings LLC, Lakeview Assets LLC, Harbor Line Group LLC. Lines connecting them, all leading to one name, Ethan Cole. Brooks exhaled lightly. "Okay," he said. "Still neutral, still controlled." He turned the page. Third section, correlation transfers versus property acquisitions. Side-by-side columns. Dates of money leaving Richard and Charlotte's joint account. Dates of property purchases under those LLCs. The alignment was tight, within days, sometimes within hours. Brooks stopped flipping pages. Looked up. "When did you start tracking this?" he asked. Richard didn't hesitate. "March." Brooks nodded slowly. "Before the filing?" "Yes." Another nod. Brooks leaned back in his chair, studying Richard now. Not the documents, the man who made them. "You didn't tell me any of this before today," Brooks said. "Because it wasn't necessary," Richard replied. Brooks raised an eyebrow slightly. "Necessary for what? For her to act first." That answer landed, quiet, precise. Brooks let the silence sit for a moment. Then he leaned forward again. "You're saying you let this play out," he said. Richard didn't correct him, because it wasn't inaccurate. "I needed the structure in place," Richard said. "Divorce filing, asset claims, legal positioning." Brooks nodded. "You wanted her committed to a version of the story." "Yes." Now Brooks understood. Not just the data, the strategy. He flipped back to the first section, tapped a finger lightly on one of the entries. $18,700, he read. North Bend Holdings. Then another. $9,250, same recipient. He looked up. "These are marital funds." Yes. And they're being transferred to entities tied to a third party? Yes. Brooks leaned back again. Now the pieces aligned. Commingling, he said. Potentially, Richard replied. Brooks shook his head slightly. No, he corrected. Not potentially. He tapped the page again. This is textbook. Richard didn't respond. He let Brooks reach the conclusion himself, because conclusions held more weight when they weren't given. Brooks stood up, walked to the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the parking lot. This changes everything he said. Richard stayed seated. Still. How far do you want to take it? Brooks asked. Richard considered that. Not emotionally, structurally, as far as the evidence supports, he said. Brooks turned back. That could mean full asset reevaluation, he said. Court-ordered disclosures, possibly forensic accounting. Richard nodded. I expected that. Brooks studied him again. You really did, he said. Not a question, an observation. Richard didn't respond, because there was nothing to add. Brooks walked back to the desk, sat down, opened the folder again. Who else knows about this? He asked. No one, Richard said. Not even Charlotte and Brooks nodded. Good. He flipped to the last page. There was one more section, smaller, less data, but more focused. Access logs anomalies, login times, devices, locations. One entry circled. 2:13 a.m. Unknown device. Brooks tapped it. This matters, he said. Richard nodded. It suggests shared access. Brooks continued. Or at least external use, Ethan Richards said. Brooks didn't confirm, didn't deny, but the implication was clear. Can you prove that Brooks asked? Not yet, Richards said. Then we don't claim it, Brooks replied. I know, again, no conflict, just alignment. Brooks closed the folder slowly, then placed both hands on it. This gives us leverage, he said, not immediately in court, but in discovery. Richard listened. We request full financial disclosure, Brooks continued. All entities, all transfers, all ownership structures. He paused. Once that process starts, she can't control the narrative anymore. Richard nodded once. That was the point. Not to accuse, to expose. Brooks leaned forward slightly. Why the delay, he asked. You had enough to raise concern weeks ago. Richard looked at the folder, then back at Brooks. Because concern isn't enough, he said. Brooks waited. Commitment is, Richard added. Commitment to what? To a position she can't easily change. Brooks exhaled slowly. Understanding settling in. She filed first, Brooks said. Yes. She presented a full asset claim? Yes. She signed it. Yes. Brooks nodded. Now she owns that version. Richard didn't respond. But that was exactly it. The story had been told, officially, filed, signed, and now it could be tested. Brooks stood again, this time more decisive. I'll draft the response, he said. We request full disclosure. We flag discrepancies without accusations. He paused. Then we let the system do what it's designed to do. Richard stood as well, picked up the folder, closed it. Understood. They walked to the door. Before opening it, Brooks stopped, turned back. One more thing, he said. Richard waited. If this goes where I think it's going, she's going to realize what you have. Richard nodded. Eventually. Brooks studied him. And when she does, Richard's expression didn't change, but his answer was immediate. She'll be too late. Brooks held his gaze for a moment, then opened the door. The hallway was quiet again. Same carpet, same muted tones. But the situation had shifted. Not visibly. Not yet. But structurally. Richard walked out of the office without looking back. Outside, the air felt colder, or maybe sharper. He got into his car, placed the folder on the passenger seat, started the engine. As he pulled out of the parking lot, one thought settled clearly. The case wasn't about what Charlotte had taken, it was about what she had moved. And movement left trails. Trails that the system was now ready to follow. The response was filed 48 hours later. Richard didn't watch Daniel Brooks submit it. He didn't need to. At 9:16 a.m., a confirmation email appeared in his inbox. Subject Respondent Filing Miller v. Miller. He opened it, read the first paragraph, then skipped to the core. Request for full financial disclosure, including all associated entities, transfers and ownership structures connected to both parties during the marriage. Clean, precise, no accusations, just a request. But Richard knew what it triggered. Process. And process meant exposure. At 9:42 a.m., his phone buzzed. Charlotte. He let it ring twice, then answered. Yeah. No greeting, no tension, just acknowledgement. What is this? Charlotte's voice came through sharp, controlled but tighter than usual. Richard leaned back in his chair. What do you mean, he asked. The filing, she said. Your lawyer is requesting full financial disclosure. Richard didn't respond immediately. He opened his calendar, looked at the empty slot at 10:00 a.m., then back to nothing. It's standard, he said. Charlotte exhaled. Not calm, not yet. No, it's not, she replied. Not at this stage. Richard turned slightly in his chair, facing the window. It is if there are questions, he said. There was a pause, longer than usual. What questions Charlotte asked. Her tone shifted, not aggressive, careful. Richard noticed. He didn't answer directly. Anything we need to clarify, he said. Charlotte didn't speak for a moment. Richard could hear something faint in the background. Movement, a door closing. She had stepped somewhere private. Richard, she said lower now. We agreed to keep this clean. Richard watched a car pass outside the building, slow, steady. I haven't made it messy, he said. Another pause. Then, this feels like you're making it messy. Richard's fingers rested lightly on the desk. Still, I'm following the process, he replied. That word again, process. Charlotte knew what it meant. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't negotiable, it was mechanical, and machines didn't respond to pressure. Why now, she asked. Direct. Richard didn't answer immediately, because timing mattered. Because we're here now, he said. Not wrong, not complete. Charlotte's breathing changed slightly, faster. You didn't have a problem with the agreement before, she said. Richard almost smiled. Almost. But it didn't reach his face. I didn't say that, he replied. You didn't say anything, she shot back? Correct. Richard let that sit. Because silence wasn't absence. It was positioning. What are you looking for? Charlotte asked. Now the question had weight. Not defensive, concerned. Richard didn't answer. Not directly. Whatever's there, he said. That was enough. Charlotte didn't respond immediately. Richard could hear her thinking. Not through words, through absence. I'll talk to Amanda, she said finally. Okay, Richard. She stopped, mid-sentence. Richard waited, but she didn't continue. Instead, I'll call you later. The line disconnected. Richard lowered the phone, placed it on the desk, exactly parallel to the edge. Then he opened his notes, added a new line. Event disclosure request triggered response from Charlotte. Then beneath it, tone shift controlled. Pressured. He underlined pressured once. Not heavily. Just enough. At 11:03 a.m., Brooks called. She reached out, he said without preamble. Richard nodded slightly, even though Brooks couldn't see him. I assumed she would. She's pushing back, Brooks continued. Says it's unnecessary. Claims everything is already disclosed. Richard leaned back. What did you tell her, he asked. That we're not accusing Brooks, said we're verifying. Richard nodded. Correct approach. She's not comfortable, Brooks added. Richard didn't respond. Comfort wasn't part of the process. She might try to limit scope, Brooks continued. Reduce what we can request. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Can she? He asked. Not easily, Brooks said, not without raising questions. Exactly. Pressure created resistance. Resistance created visibility. Let her push, Richard said. Brooks paused. Then you want her to, yes. Another pause. Brooks understood. Because if she pushes, Brooks said slowly, it looks like she has something to hide. Richard didn't confirm. Didn't need to. That's a risky line, Brooks added. Only if there's nothing there, Richard said, silence. Then Brooks exhaled. All right, he said. We proceed. They ended the call. Richard sat still for a moment, then returned to work. Not the case. His actual job. Numbers, reports, routine. Because consistency mattered. Even now. Especially now. That evening, Charlotte didn't come home. At 8:22 p.m., a message arrived. Staying downtown again. Short. No explanation. Richard read it. Didn't reply. Instead, he opened his laptop, pulled up the spreadsheet, added a new column. Behavioral shift. Then entered 0429. Increased distance overnight absence consistent. He didn't interpret, he recorded. At 9:05 p.m., he opened another file. The entity mapping. He stared at the 3 LLCs again. North Bend, Lakeview, Harbor Line. Then at the name beneath them, Ethan Cole. Richard clicked into a new tab, pulled up public records again, but this time he filtered differently. Not by company, by individual. Ethan Cole. Personal filings, recent changes. There. A new entry. Filed just 2 weeks ago. Amendment to ownership structure. Harbor Line Group LLC. Richard leaned closer, scrolling slowly. The document was brief, but specific. Addition of a secondary authorized signatory, name redacted in the public view, but the timing lined up. Exactly. Richard sat back. His fingers rested on the keyboard. Still. Then he opened his notes. Typed Harbor Line Amendment, new signatory timing aligns with increased transfers. He paused. Then added, high probability Charlotte involvement. He didn't mark it as fact. Not yet. But the pattern was tightening. And patterns, when they aligned across systems, money, ownership, behavior, became difficult to ignore. Richard closed the laptop. The room fell quiet again. No television, no background noise. Just stillness. He stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank half, set it down, then looked at the empty space where Charlotte usually stood. Same counter, same light, same position, but different context now, because for the first time, she wasn't controlling the timeline anymore. The system was, and the system didn't forget anything. The first formal discovery request went out the next morning. At 8:05 a.m., Daniel Brooks submitted it. Not aggressive, not accusatory, but precise. A request for documentation covering every entity connected to Charlotte Miller within the last 12 months. Bank records, authorization lists, ownership structures, amendments, everything that could move money, everything that could hide it. Richard didn't open the email notification right away. He saw it, left it unread, finished his coffee first, black, no sugar. Same as every morning. Routine mattered. At 8:22 a.m., he opened the message, read the confirmation, then closed it. No reaction. Because the action wasn't the point. The response would be. At 9:11 a.m., Charlotte called again. Faster this time. Less delay. Richard answered on the first ring. Yes. No greeting. What exactly are you trying to do? Charlotte asked. No preamble, no soft entry. Straight to the question. Richard leaned back in his chair. His office window reflected a faint outline of his face. Still, Neutral. I told you, he said. I'm following the process. That's not an answer, she replied. Her tone was sharper now. Edges showing. Richard didn't match it. It is, he said. Silence, then. You're asking for things that have nothing to do with the divorce, Charlotte said. Richard turned slightly, looked at the edge of his desk, aligned his pen parallel to it. Small adjustment. Everything connected to marital assets is relevant, he said. Charlotte exhaled. Not controlled this time. Audible. You're overreaching, she said. Richard didn't respond immediately. Because that word mattered. Overreaching. It suggested fear of scope. And scope was exactly what the system enforced. Then it should be easy to provide, he said. Another pause. Longer. Richard could almost map her thinking, calculating, adjusting. What are you expecting to find, she asked. Different angle, less aggressive, more probing. Richard's answer came without hesitation. Consistency. That word hung in the air. Not accusation, not suspicion. But it carried weight. Because inconsistency meant exposure. Charlotte didn't speak for a moment. Then, this is unnecessary, she said again. Softer now. Not convincing. Not even to herself. Richard remained still. You filed for divorce, he said. You presented a structure. I'm reviewing it. Another pause. Then you didn't care before, Charlotte said. Same line. Repeated. Richard noticed. Patterns weren't just in data, they were in language. I didn't respond before he corrected. That difference mattered. Charlotte didn't reply immediately, because the correction shifted control again. She tried another approach. We can settle this without dragging it out, she said. Offer. Soft pressure. Efficiency. Richard didn't reject it, but he didn't accept it either. Then it should resolve quickly, he said. Neutral, closed. Charlotte's breathing changed again, faster, less measured, because every path she took led back to the same place, disclosure full, uncontrolled. I'll talk to Amanda, she said again. Yes. This time she didn't say she'd call back. She just hung up. Richard placed the phone down. Same position, same alignment. Then he opened his notebook. New entry. Event second call increased pressure. Then beneath it, language repetition, unnecessary, overreaching. He paused. Then added, confidence decreasing. He underlined that once. At 10:47 a.m., Brooks called again. She's pushing harder, he said. Richard nodded slightly. I expected that. She's requesting limitations on the scope, Brooks continued, trying to narrow it to only directly titled assets. Richard leaned back. Will it work? He asked. No, Brooks said. Not without raising red flags. Exactly. Resistance created visibility. They're concerned, Brooks added. Richard didn't respond. Concern wasn't useful. Behavior was. They also asked for an informal discussion, Brooks said. Richard's eyes shifted slightly. About what settlement, Brooks replied. Quick resolution? Minimal review. Richard stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the parking lot below. Cars parked in straight lines. Predictable. Ordered. No, he said. Simple. Immediate. Brooks paused. Are you sure, he asked. It could end this quickly. Richard watched a man cross the lot, phone in hand, not looking up. Yes, he said. No hesitation. Because speed favored whoever had less to hide, and Richard wasn't the one moving assets, understood, Brooks said. Then we proceed as planned. They ended the call. Richard stayed at the window for a moment longer, then returned to his desk, opened his laptop, pulled up the entity mapping again. 3 names. North Bend, Lakeview, Harbor Line. He clicked into Harbor Line, scrolled to the amendment again. New signatory. Redacted. But timing aligned. Always timing. Richard opened another tab. Cross-referenced transaction dates. April 12th, April 18th, April 21st. Each transfer, each movement, each step. Then he opened his notes. Typed, "Transfers increase following Harbor Line amendment." He paused. Then added, "Pattern suggests operational role, not passive." That distinction mattered. Passive meant investment. Operational meant control. Control meant responsibility. Responsibility meant liability. Richard closed the laptop slowly. The room was quiet again. But not empty. Because now, the structure was complete enough, not fully proven, but aligned. Money, entities, behavior, legal positioning, all moving in the same direction, that was enough. Downstairs later that evening, the house felt colder. Not physically, structurally. Charlotte still hadn't returned. At 9:03 p.m., another message appeared. "Working late. Shorter now. Less explanation." Richard read it. Didn't respond. He walked to the kitchen, placed his glass on the counter. Same spot, every time. Then he stood there, looking at nothing, but seeing everything. Because for the first time, Charlotte wasn't ahead of the situation anymore. She was reacting, and reacting was slower than planning. Richard turned off the kitchen light. The room fell into darkness, and in that darkness, the next phase had already begun, not in court, not in conversation, but in the gap between what was claimed and what could be proven. Charlotte didn't call again that night. Not at 10 p.m., not at midnight, not even the next morning. That was new. Richard noticed. He didn't interpret it. He recorded it. At 7:14 a.m., he added a new line in his notebook. Communication gap. No follow-up after escalation. He underlined nothing. Because silence at this stage didn't need emphasis. It meant recalculation. At 9:32 a.m., Daniel Brooks called. "They responded," he said. Richard didn't ask who, he knew. "What did they send?" he asked. "A partial disclosure," Brooks replied. "Limited, controlled." Richard leaned back in his chair. "How limited?" Brooks paused. "Bank statements for primary accounts, nothing on the LLCs." Richard's eyes didn't move. "Expected," he said. Brooks exhaled lightly. "They're trying to contain it," he added. Of course they were. Containment was the first move when exposure risk increased. "What's our response?" Richard asked. Brooks didn't hesitate. "We push, simple, clean," Richard nodded. "How?" he asked. "We file a motion to compel," Brooks said. "Request full disclosure under court supervision." That was escalation. Formal, structured, difficult to avoid. "Timing?" Richard asked. "Today," Brooks said. Richard stood, walked to the window again. Same position, same view, cars, lines, predictable movement. "Do it," he said. Brooks didn't respond immediately. "You're sure?" he asked. "Once we file that, there's no informal path left." Richard watched a car pull into a space. Perfect alignment. Engine off, door open, routine, yes, he said. Because informal paths required trust. And trust was no longer part of the system. "All right," Brooks said. "I'll draft it." They ended the call. Richard remained still, not thinking, not reacting, just observing the shift. Because the case had moved from negotiation to enforcement. At 11:08 a.m., Charlotte called again. This time Richard let it ring longer. 5 rings. 6. Then he answered. "Yes." Her voice came through immediately. "You filed a motion, no greeting, no preamble. Direct." Richard didn't deny it. "Yes." A sharp inhale. Audible. "That was unnecessary," she said. "Same word. Repeat it again." Pattern confirmed. Richard didn't respond. He let her continue. "We already sent what was required," she added. Richard turned slightly in his chair. What was required by who, he asked. That question landed, because required had no authority without definition. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. "Our agreement," she said finally. Richard almost smiled again. Almost. We don't have an agreement, he said. Flat, final. Silence. Then we had a preliminary one, she insisted. Preliminary isn't final, Richard replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now the structure was collapsing. Not visibly, but internally. You're dragging this out, Charlotte said. Her tone shifted again. Frustration. Not fully controlled. Richard didn't match it. I'm clarifying it, he said. The difference mattered. Dragging implied delay. Clarifying implied necessity. Charlotte exhaled sharply. This is going to cost both of us, she said. Money, time, effort, pressure. Richard acknowledged the statement. Yes, no denial, no argument. Because it was true. But as truth didn't determine action, structure did. Then why are you doing it? She asked. This time the question wasn't sharp. It was real. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the conversation. She was trying to understand it. Richard leaned forward slightly, hands resting on the desk. Because the numbers don't align, he said. Simple. Direct. No accusation, but specific. Charlotte didn't speak. Not immediately. Richard could hear her breathing again, faster now. Less measured. What numbers, she asked. Quiet. Careful. Richard didn't answer directly. Everything we submitted, he said. Everything that moved. Another pause. Longer. Because now, she knew. Not everything, but enough. You're making assumptions, she said. Weaker now, less confident. Richard shook his head slightly. No, he said. I'm requesting documentation. Silence. Heavy this time. Because documentation couldn't be argued. It could only be provided. Or avoided. You don't understand how these things work, Charlotte said finally. New angle, subtle shift, positioning herself as knowledgeable. Richard didn't react. Then it should be easy to explain, he said. Another pause. No immediate response. Because explanation required detail. And detail required consistency. And consistency was exactly what she couldn't guarantee anymore. I'll talk to Amanda, she said again. Same line. Third time, but this time it sounded different. Not confident, not controlled, reactive. Yes, Richard said. He didn't add anything. Didn't push further. Because the pressure was already in place. And pressure didn't need repetition. The line disconnected. Richard placed the phone down. Same position. Same alignment. Then he opened his notebook. New entry. Event motion to compel triggers direct confrontation. Then beneath it, language weakening repetition without variation. He paused. Then added, awareness threshold crossed. He underlined that once, because this mattered. This was the point where Charlotte shifted from control to awareness, and awareness changed behavior. At 1:26 p.m., Brooks called again. It's filed, he said. Richard nodded. Good. She's going to fight this, Brooks added. Let her, Richard replied. Brooks paused. Then you're very calm about this. Richard looked at his desk. Everything aligned, everything in place. It's predictable, he said. That was the difference. Chaos created stress. Structure removed it. And if she pushes back hard, Brooks asked. Richard didn't hesitate. Then she exposes more. Brooks didn't respond immediately, because that answer wasn't emotional, it was strategic. All right, he said finally. We wait. They ended the call. Richard closed his notebook, placed it back in the drawer. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water. Same motion, same position. But the situation had shifted again. Because now it wasn't about what Charlotte wanted to show. It was about what she couldn't hide, and the system was no longer optional. The hearing for the motion to compel was set for the following Monday. 8:30 a.m., same courtroom, same judge, different posture. Richard arrived early. 8:02 a.m. He didn't sit immediately. He stood near the back wall, watching the room fill. Lawyers moved with purpose. Clients followed quietly behind them. Files stacked, phones checked, voices low, controlled chaos, structured. Daniel Brooks arrived at 8:11. He didn't greet Richard with small talk. "Everything's in order," he said. Richard nodded. "I assumed." Brooks glanced across the room. Charlotte was already there, seated this time, not standing, not moving. Still, that was new. Amanda Pierce sat beside her, flipping through a thick binder. More pages than before, more tabs, more weight. "They're prepared," Brooks said quietly. Richard followed his gaze. Yes. But preparation didn't equal control. Not anymore. "They submitted additional documents late last night," Brooks added. Richard turned slightly. "What kind?" "Partial disclosures on two entities," Brooks said. "North Bend and Lakeview." Richard's expression didn't change. "And Harbor Line?" he asked. Brooks shook his head. Still nothing. Richard nodded once. Expected. Because Harbor Line was the center, and centers were protected longer. "What's their angle?" Richard asked. "Containment," Brooks said. "Give enough to appear cooperative. Hold back what matters." Richard looked at Charlotte again. She wasn't looking at him. Her focus stayed on the table in front of her, hands resting still, too still. "She knows," Richard said quietly. Brooks didn't ask what he meant. He understood. "She knows we're close," Richard added. Brooks exhaled slowly. "Then she'll try to control the narrative before it gets there," he said. Richard didn't respond, because that attempt was already too late. At 8:29, the courtroom doors closed. The judge entered at 8:30 sharp. No delay. Proceedings began immediately. Amanda stood first, confident, structured. "We have complied in good faith with the respondent's request," she said. "Relevant financial disclosures have been provided. The additional requests are excessive and unrelated to the dissolution proceedings." Her voice was steady, measured, controlled. But Richard noticed something small. Her pacing, slightly faster than before. Not enough for most people to detect, but enough. Brooks stood when it was his turn. No rush, no theatrics. "We appreciate the disclosures that have been provided," he said. "However, they are incomplete." He paused. "Just long enough. The respondent is requesting full transparency across all entities connected to marital funds. Simple, direct, no accusation, just scope." Amanda stepped forward again. "The entities referenced are independent," she said. "They are not relevant to the marital estate." That word again, independent. Richard watched the judge. Not Amanda. The judge's pen paused, then moved again. Small signal. Brooks didn't respond immediately. He let the statement sit. "Then we are not making claims," he said. "We are requesting verification. The same line, consistent." Because consistency mattered. Amanda pressed forward. "This is an unnecessary expansion of the case," she said. "It introduces complications without basis." Richard didn't look at Charlotte. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift, pressure building, but still contained. For now. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Miss Pierce," she said, "are you asserting that no marital funds have interacted with these entities?" Amanda paused. "Not long, but enough." "No, Your Honor," she said. "We are asserting that any interaction is incidental and not material to asset division. Incidental. Another word. Carefully chosen." Richard noted it. Because words created positions, and positions could be tested. Brooks stepped in. Then full disclosure would clarify that, he said. No push, no aggression, just logic. The judge looked down at the documents in front of her, flipped one page, then another. Silence filled the room. 30 seconds. 40. A full minute. No one spoke. Because this was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, but decisive. The judge looked up. Partial compliance is not sufficient, she said. Amanda didn't interrupt. Full financial disclosure is standard when questions arise regarding asset movement, the judge continued. Richard's gaze remained steady. Not on Charlotte, not on Amanda, on the system, because the system was now speaking. I am granting the motion to compel, the judge said. Simple, final, complete disclosure is required within 10 business days. All entities, all transfers, all ownership documentation. Amanda nodded once. Professional, controlled. But the shift was clear now. No longer containment, now exposure. The gavel came down. The hearing ended. But the case had just changed. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt different. Not louder, but sharper. Charlotte stood near the wall this time. Not with Amanda. Alone. She didn't move immediately. Didn't speak. Richard stepped out with Brooks. Clean ruling, Brooks said. Richard nodded. Yes. No celebration, no reaction. Because this wasn't the end. It was the opening. Brooks turned to him. They have 10 days, he said. After that, everything comes out. Richard looked down the hallway. Charlotte hadn't left. She was watching now, directly, for the first time since the filing. Their eyes met. No anger, no emotion, just recognition. She understood. Not everything, but enough. Richard didn't look away. Neither did she. 3 seconds. 4. Then Charlotte stepped forward. Amanda moved beside her. Fast. Protective. Richard, Charlotte said. Her voice was lower now. Less controlled. More real. Richard stopped. Waited. We need to talk, she said. Not a demand, not an order, a request, first time. Richard looked at her, then at Amanda, then back at her. About what he asked. Charlotte hesitated, then, this, she said. Vague, but heavy. Richard considered it. Not emotionally. Structurally. No, he said, simple. Charlotte blinked, surprised. You're refusing to talk? She asked. Richard shook his head slightly. I'm not doing it here, he said. Amanda stepped in. We can schedule something, she said quickly, controlled again, trying to regain ground. Richard nodded once. Through counsel, he said. Nothing direct, nothing informal. Charlotte's posture shifted, slightly, but enough. Because that door was now closed. Richard turned, walked away. No hesitation, no backward glance. Behind him, Charlotte stood still. For a second longer than necessary. Because for the first time, she wasn't ahead. She wasn't controlling the pace. She was inside the system, and the system was already moving forward without her. The documents arrived on the 9th day, not the 10th. That mattered, because it meant Charlotte didn't wait for the deadline. She moved before it, which meant pressure had reached a threshold she couldn't hold. At 7:52 a.m., Richard received the notification from Daniel Brooks, subject full disclosure received. No extra words, no commentary, just confirmation. Richard didn't open it immediately. He finished his coffee first. Same routine, same timing, because routine stabilized everything else. At 8:06 a.m., he opened the email. There were 12 attachments, PDF files, structured, organized, but heavier than anything before. He downloaded them one by one, saved them into a new folder, not with a name that stood out, just a continuation of his system. Then he opened the first file, North Bend Holdings LLC, ownership documents, operating agreement, transaction records, clean, almost too clean. He moved to the next, Lakeview Assets LLC. Same pattern, same structure, different numbers, different properties, still controlled, still curated. Richard didn't stop there. He went straight to the one that mattered. Harbor Line Group. The file was larger, more pages, less clean. That was the first sign. He opened it, scrolled slowly. not rushing, because speed missed details. Page 1, formation documents. Page 2, amendments. Page 3, ownership percentages. Then he stopped. Not because of the number, because of the name. It wasn't redacted anymore. It was printed. Clear. Final. Charlotte Miller, authorized signatory. Richard didn't move. His hand rested on the mouse. Still. He read the line again. Then once more, not to confirm, to anchor it. Because this was the shift from pattern to proof. He scrolled further. Transaction logs, dates, amounts, cross-referenced, perfect alignment. April 12th, April 18th, April 21st. Every transfer he had recorded, every movement he had tracked. Now, official, documented, admitted. Richard leaned back slightly. Not in relief, in recognition. Because this was no longer something he observed. It was something the system could act on. At 8:22 a.m., his phone buzzed. Brooks. Richard answered immediately. Yes. You saw it, Brooks said. Not a question, yes. A pause. Then Brooks exhaled. That's it, he said. Simple. Final. Richard didn't respond, because it needed to be defined. The Harborline file, Brooks continued. She's listed as an authorized signatory. That ties her directly to the entity. Richard nodded slightly. Yes. And the timing. Brooks added, lines up with the transfers. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time, because now they were both looking at the same structure. Not pieces. The whole. This changes the entire case, Brooks said. Richard stood, walked to the window again. Same view, same stillness. How far does it go? Richard asked. Brooks didn't hesitate. Full asset reclassification, he said, possible concealment, potential financial misconduct. The words were heavier now. Not speculation, not theory. Legal weight. Richard watched a car reverse out of a space. Slow, controlled. This wasn't a mistake, Brooks added. No, Richard said, because mistakes didn't repeat with precision. This had been built, layer by layer, transfer by transfer, entity by entity, and now it was exposed. We need to move carefully, Brooks said. Richard nodded. Agreed. Next step is a forensic review. Brooks continued. We bring in an accountant, map everything, every dollar. Richard turned back toward the desk, looked at the open file. Charlotte's name still visible. Clear, unavoidable. Do it, he said. No hesitation, because now there was no reason to hold back. Brooks paused. Then she's going to react. Richard didn't respond, because that was expected. Pressure had already broken containment. Now it would break control. I'll file the motion. Brooks said. We escalate. Yes. The call ended. Richard placed the phone down. Then he opened his notebook. New page. He didn't rush writing. He wrote slowly. Eventful disclosure received. Harborline confirms direct involvement. He paused. Then added pattern. Proof. He underlined it. Twice. Because this was the pivot. The moment everything shifted from observation to undeniable structure. At 10:14 a.m., Charlotte called. Richard watched the phone ring. Once, twice, 3 times. He answered on the 4th. Yes, no greeting. Her voice came through immediately. Different now. No sharp edges. No controlled tone. Just direct. We need to talk, she said. Not structured, not rehearsed. Real. Richard didn't respond immediately. He let the silence sit, because silence forced clarity about what he asked. Charlotte exhaled. Audible. You know what she said. Not vague, not this time. Richard looked at the screen, at her name, then at the file still open on his desk. I'm reviewing the documents, he said. Another pause. Shorter, because now she knew he had seen it. All of them, she asked. Yes. Silence. Long. Heavy. Then Richard. It's not what you think. The line came out slower. Careful. Measured again. But different. Because now, she was explaining, not controlling. Richard didn't challenge it. He didn't agree either. What do I think he asked? Simple, neutral. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Because the question, forced definition. It's just business, she said finally. Richard almost smiled again. Almost. Because that line didn't match the structure anymore. Then it will hold up, he said. Calm, direct. No emotion. Another silence. Then, this doesn't have to go further, Charlotte said. New angle. Not denial, containment, again, but weaker now. Then it won't, Richard replied. Her breathing shifted. Faster. Because the answer didn't give her control. It returned it to the system. We can settle, she said. Quieter, less certain. Richard didn't respond immediately. He looked at the document again. Her name, her signature, her role. Then he spoke. Through counsel, he said. Same boundary, unchanged. Charlotte didn't argue. Didn't push. Because now she understood. The conversation was no longer between them. It was inside the system. And the system was already moving. The line disconnected. Richard sat back in his chair, closed the Harbor Line file. Not because he was done, but because he had seen enough. Everything after this was process. And process didn't require emotion. It required time. And time was now on his side. The forensic report took 6 days. Not 5, not rushed. Because Daniel Brooks didn't hire someone who moved fast. He hired someone who didn't miss. At 7:38 a.m. on the 6th day, Richard received the file. Subject: Forensic Summary Preliminary Findings. No extra commentary. Just the document. Richard opened it immediately this time. No delay, no routine. Because this was the final layer. The report was 43 pages. Structured, clean, cold, no emotion. Just data. Richard didn't read it top to bottom. He went straight to the summary. Page 3. Findings indicate systematic transfer of marital funds into third-party entities under partial control of petitioner Charlotte Miller. He read the sentence once, then again. Slow, deliberate. Because this wasn't assumption. This was conclusion. He continued. Transactions were not incidental in nature. Patterns show intentional structuring of transfers to align with asset acquisition under affiliated LLCs. Intentional, structured, aligned. Every word mattered. Richard leaned back slightly, not in reaction, in confirmation. Because everything he had seen, everything he had mapped, now existed independently of him, validated, external, usable. He turned to the page. Charts, flow diagrams, money moving from joint account, LLCs, property acquisitions, clear, visual, undeniable. He stopped again at a section labeled Control Indicators, Bullet Points, Authorized Signatory Status, Charlotte Miller, Harbor Line Group LLC, repeated transaction initiation timestamps linked to petitioner device, correlation between petitioner communication logs and transaction timing. Richard's eyes moved slower now, not scanning, reading, because this was the part that mattered in court. Not just movement, control, responsibility. He closed the report halfway. Not finished, but enough. Because the structure was complete. Money, entities, timing, control, everything aligned. At 8:12 a.m., Brooks called. You read it? He said. Yes. A pause. Then Brooks exhaled. That's as clean as it gets, he said. Richard didn't respond. Because clean wasn't the right word. It was precise. What's the next step, Richard asked. Brooks didn't hesitate. "We file for asset reclassification," he said, "and sanctions if needed. Heavy, direct, final." Richard stood, walked to the window again. Same view, same stillness, but everything beneath it had changed. "How does that play out?" he asked. Brooks answered immediately. "The court reevaluates everything he said. Property accounts ownership claims." He paused. "Nothing stays where it is now." Richard nodded. "That was expected." "She loses position," Brooks added. "Not emotionally, structurally." "She already did," Richard said. "Quiet, flat." "True." Brooks didn't argue. "Do we push it all the way?" he asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked at the report again, at the diagrams, at the names, at Charlotte's role. Then he spoke. "Yes." No hesitation, because stopping now would make everything before it meaningless. "All right," Brooks said. "I'll prepare the filing." They ended the call. At 9:27 a.m., Charlotte called. Richard looked at the screen. Her name. Steady. He answered on the second ring. "Yes." Her voice came through immediately. Not controlled, not structured, not like before. "I saw the report," she said, direct. No framing, no setup. Richard didn't respond. He let her continue. "They're exaggerating," she said quickly. "That's not what happened." Richard leaned back in his chair. "What part?" he asked. Simple, direct. No accusation, just a question. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Because now, she had to choose, define, commit. "It's just business structuring," she said. "Ethan handles that. I wasn't—" She stopped, mid-sentence. Richard didn't interrupt, because interruption broke flow, and flow revealed truth. You were what he asked. Quiet, even. Charlotte exhaled sharply. "I wasn't controlling anything," she said. There it was. The claim, clear, defensive. Richard looked at the report again, at the section labeled Control Indicators, then back at nothing. "The documents say otherwise," he said. "No emphasis, no pressure, just fact." Silence long, heavy. Because now, the conversation wasn't between them. It was between her claim and the evidence. "You don't understand how this works," Charlotte said again. Same line, but weaker now. Repetition without strength. Richard didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, because silence forced alignment. "Then explain it," he said. Short, direct. Charlotte didn't speak, because explanation required structure. And structure was already defined in the report. "This doesn't have to go to court," she said finally. "Different angle. Not denial, containment, last attempt." Richard didn't reject it, but he didn't accept it either. "It already is," he said. Another pause. "Then we can settle," she said. Quieter now. Less certain. Richard considered it. Not emotionally. Structurally. Settlement now would mean compromise, reduction, control regained on her side. He looked at the report again, at the alignment, at the proof. "No," he said, "simple, final." Charlotte didn't respond immediately, because that answer closed the last informal path. "You're really going to do this," she said. Not a question. A realization. Richard didn't answer, because there was nothing to add. Everything had already been decided. The line stayed open for a second longer, then disconnected. Richard placed the phone down. Same position, same alignment. Then he opened his notebook. New entry. Event forensic report confirms full structure. He paused, then added, denial phase. Containment, negotiation, collapse. He underlined collapse. Once. Because that was the stage now. Not conflict, not argument. Collapse of structure. And once structure collapsed, everything inside it followed. Richard closed the notebook, placed it back in the drawer. Then he sat still. For the first time since the case began, There was nothing left to uncover, only to present. And presentation didn't require effort, it required timing. The final hearing was already scheduled, and when it came, everything would be laid out, not by him, not by Charlotte, but by the system. And the system didn't negotiate with facts. The final hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m., 3 weeks after the forensic report. 3 weeks of silence, no calls from Charlotte, no messages, no attempts to negotiate. That absence mattered, not because it was peaceful, because it meant everything had already been decided behind closed doors. Richard arrived at 8:21 a.m. Same courtroom, same hallway, same system, but different position. He wasn't observing anymore. He was waiting for confirmation. Daniel Brooks met him near the entrance. "All filings are in," he said. "No surprises." Richard nodded. "Any response from their side?" he asked. Brooks shook his head. "Minimal. No counter-analysis, no alternative explanation. That mattered more than anything. Because silence at this stage wasn't strategy. It was limitation. "They're not contesting the report?" Richard asked. No, Brooks said. Not directly. Richard looked down the hallway. Charlotte hadn't arrived yet. "That means they can't," he said. Brooks didn't respond, because that was already understood. At 8:56 a.m., Charlotte walked in. Not rushed, not late, controlled, but different. She wasn't dressed for presence. No statement, no projection, just neutral. Amanda Pierce followed beside her. Binder thinner this time. Less material, less to hold. Charlotte didn't look at Richard, not immediately. She sat, hands resting on the table. Still, not too still, but not relaxed either. Richard noticed everything, not emotionally, structurally, because behavior always aligned with position. At 9:00 a.m., the judge entered. Proceedings began immediately. No delay, no ceremony. Brooks stood first. No long introduction, no narrative, just structure. "Your Honor, we submit the forensic analysis as Exhibit A," he said. "It establishes direct involvement of the petitioner in the transfer and control of marital funds through affiliated entities. Simple, direct, no embellishment." Amanda stood, slower than before, less certainty in her posture. "We acknowledge the report," she said. "However, we maintain that the intent behind these transactions was not to conceal assets." Intent. That word again. Always the last defense, because structure was already proven. Now they argued meaning. The judge looked at the report, then back at Amanda. "Are you contesting the accuracy of the findings?" she asked. Amanda paused. "1 second. 2. "No, Your Honor," she said. That was it. That single answer. Closed the final gap. Richard didn't move, didn't react. But he marked it. Because once accuracy wasn't contested, everything else followed. Brooks didn't press. He didn't need to. The pattern of transfers aligns with asset acquisition outside of declared marital holdings, he said. "We request full reclassification. Clear, defined, structured." The judge nodded slightly, then looked at Charlotte. "Miss Miller," she said, "do you have anything to add?" Silence. The room shifted. Not loudly, but noticeably. Because this was no longer about lawyers. It was about her. Charlotte looked forward. Not at Richard, not at Amanda. Straight ahead. Then she spoke. It wasn't meant to look like this. Her voice was steady, but thinner. Less control, less structure. Richard didn't react, because that sentence didn't change anything. The judge waited. No interruption, no guidance. Charlotte continued. "It was business," she said. "It wasn't about hiding anything. Same line, different tone. But now, it carried no weight, because the system didn't evaluate intention. It evaluated structure." The judge nodded once, then looked back at the report. Silence filled the room again. 30 seconds. 40. A full minute. No one spoke, because everything that needed to be said had already been documented. Finally, the judge spoke. The court finds that the petitioner engaged in structured financial transfers that materially impact the classification of marital assets. Each word landed clean, measured, final. Richard remained still, not reacting, because this wasn't a moment, it was a conclusion. Accordingly, the judge continued the court order's full reclassification of the affected assets. There it was. Everything shifted. Not partially, completely. All entities and acquisitions tied to these transfers are to be considered part of the marital estate. Amanda lowered her gaze slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because this was the collapse. The division will be recalculated accordingly, the judge finished. The gavel came down. Sharp, final. The hearing ended. No applause, no reaction, just movement. Chairs sliding, papers collected, people leaving. Richard stood, calm, unchanged. Brooks turned to him. "That's it," he said. Richard nodded. Yes. No satisfaction. No visible emotion. Because this was never about winning. It was about alignment. Truth aligning with structure. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt quieter. Charlotte stood near the exit, alone again. Amanda had stepped away. For the first time since this began, she wasn't shielded. Richard walked toward the exit. He didn't intend to stop, but Charlotte spoke. "Richard." He paused, turned slightly, waited. "No rush, no tension. I didn't think you'd go this far," she said. "Not defensive, not aggressive, just acknowledgement." Richard looked at her, then answered. "I didn't either." True, because this had never been about escalation. It had been about process. Charlotte nodded once, slow, as if something finally settled. "I underestimated you," she said. Richard didn't respond, because that wasn't the point. She exhaled, not sharply, not dramatically, just release. Then she stepped aside, clearing the path. Richard walked past her. No hesitation, no backward glance. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just neutral. The system had done its job, and when it did, there was nothing left to carry. Richard reached his car, paused for a second, hand on the door. Then he opened it, sat down, closed the door. Silence. No phone, no messages, no pending actions. For the first time in months, everything was resolved. Not emotionally, structurally. And structure was enough. There's a moment in life when words stop mattering. Not because people stop talking, but because evidence starts speaking louder. Richard never raised his voice. He never chased arguments. He didn't try to prove himself in conversations that had no structure. He waited. He observed. He documented. And when the time came, he didn't fight with emotion. He let the system reveal the truth. In real life, most people lose not because they are wrong, but because they react too early. They argue without evidence. They defend without structure. They move before they understand. Patience is not weakness. Silence is not defeat. Sometimes the strongest position is the one that doesn't rush. So I want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you knew something wasn't right, but chose to stay quiet and wait for the right moment? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story gave you something to think about, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow's story will show you what happens when someone fights back without ever raising their voice.